Welcome to another seminar sponsored by the Center for Teaching Excellence. I'm really excited today because today we're going to be hearing about a project, a scholarly project on teaching and learning, which is a little different than a lot of the other things that we have. I think that there'll be some interesting findings that are going to be presented. Our facilitators and presenters today are David Feldon, who's a professor in education at University of Virginia, and Briana Timmerman, who's sitting next to me, who is Associate Dean in the Honors College here at the University of South Carolina. They both have a really strong background and a strong interest in science, math, and engineering education, and I'm looking forward to their presentation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So, quick, just a little bit of background about the project that we're going to be talking about. The findings we're going to be presenting today are supported by a grant from the National Science Foundation in their REASE program, which is the Division of Research on Learning. It's the large-scale grants focused on STEM learning, science, technology, engineering, and math. And for a long time, NSF has been very interested in possible connections between teaching activities and research activities because, of course, they have a dual mission. One is to support scientific research in STEM disciplines, and the other is to support science education writ large, all the way from kindergarten and pre-K programs up through graduate level training. And so when we put in a proposal proposing to look at sort of what interactions might exist between teaching activities and research activities, that would seem to be compelling to them, and we're currently in year 3 of a 3-year funded study. So before we start, before we get into the findings, a few words of background about the role that teaching and research play. For faculty, traditionally, there's both a research and a teaching obligation. And as time has moved forward, the role of teaching has changed somewhat. It used to be, a generation ago, that teaching was one of the major responsibilities, and that some people did a lot of research and some people did very little research, but that the primary obligation of a faculty member was really to help prepare students who are coming through at the undergraduate and graduate levels. But that role and that allocation of time and effort has changed. Now, research is what drives most of faculty time. It's certainly what drives the faculty reward structure. People get tenured, promoted, get performance raises on the basis of their research performance, their grant dollars, their publications, not so much on their course reviews or teaching loads. Especially at the Tier 1 level. Obviously, when you get to more teaching-specific institutions, that changes. And one of the outcomes of this is that teaching is often viewed as a distraction or even actively detracting from the real work, the work that's supposed to be important. And when people get research grants, one of the first things that many do is first they tend to fill their summer salaries, and then once you have summer salary coming in, then the next priority is to buy out of teaching. So you're spending less time teaching, more time doing research, and this all works very well if we're only worried about research. But being a university with students, and further, particularly in the case of South Carolina being a land-grant institution, there are significant obligations that the institution has to prepare students, and presumably that would mean taking faculty with high levels of skill and putting them in a position to help guide students as they acquire skills within these disciplines. In terms of students' roles, when we look at graduate students who come in and are looking for financial support, typically, people either receive a research assistantship or a teaching assistantship. And the research assistantships, the ones that don't involve a teaching obligation, often go to the people who come in the highest ranked in the cohort that's been accepted into a graduate program. The people who are strongest, the people in whom faculty have the greatest interest in a scholarly capacity, get given full-time research slots. Not all the time, but a good deal of the time. And then sort of the next cut down will get teaching support, and the lowest cut they're on their own to find funding. And so this privileging of the research role in the university context, it plays out both at the faculty level and at the student level, and actually at the interaction between student and faculty, because many graduate advisors actively discourage their students from teaching. If you can avoid getting to be a TA, avoid getting to be a TA. It's a really bad thing. And so, and actually in interviewing participants in our study and findings from other folks who have been talking to graduate students, it turns out that some grad students have a dirty little secret. They really want to teach. They like teaching. They hope when they get their degree not just to do research, but actually to go out and teach. But they feel like they have to keep it to themselves, that they can't share that in an open forum with their faculty advisor, because that's not what's valued. That's not what's considered acceptable or appropriate as a graduate student. And again, we're focusing on folks in STEM disciplines: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, though this definitely shows up in any number of other research-intensive areas. I can't speak very much to the humanities side of things. So one of NSF's concerns is over this is what they call the STEM pipeline, and this is the figurative pipeline that moves people through the preparation in a STEM discipline and into workforce, right? Because of course the NSF has an interest in making sure that there's a national workforce sufficient to meet the scientific and technological needs of the United States for competitiveness and so on. And so those concerns link not only to the number and diversity of people moving through the pipeline, but also to the quality of instruction that they receive. And again, because we've seen that teaching often gets short shrift, that more resources get put into research than into teaching, more value gets placed on research than on teaching. And it's interesting that that's the case, because a lot of work has gone into looking at the relationship between teaching and teaching quality and student outcomes. And it turns out that not just at the K-12 level, but at the undergraduate and even at the graduate level, the quality of teaching is linked not only to achievement, how well people do, but also to attrition, how likely they are to stay in. There was a large-scale national study that was done with about 4,000 undergraduates who declared majors in STEM disciplines, and a huge percentage of them dropped out, either changed majors out of a STEM field or stopped going to school altogether. And 90% of the people who dropped out cited poor instruction as one of the main reasons for leaving. And of the people who didn't drop out, about 76% said that poor instruction was a major problem. So if we're worried about a STEM pipeline and worried about folks coming through the education system, the university system, being prepared to be active members of the workforce in STEM disciplines, and we are systematically neglecting teaching, we are systematically narrowing the pipeline and making sure that fewer people get to the other end. So there have been a number of programs that have tried to train people to become integrated professionals. PFF is preparing future faculty, which was a major initiative that went through probably about 10 years ago, and was focused on developing student skills not just at a scholarly level, but also at a teaching level and at an institutional service level, really trying to capture the various roles that faculty members are expected to play in the ideal, and preparing them so that when they left graduate school and postdoctoral training and went into faculty positions, they were better able to adequately attend to all three. And one of the main areas of emphasis here is socialization into the discipline, right? So the quote from Damrosch: one enters a discipline by becoming a successful disciple. Right, so that students who come in and are preparing to be faculty, or preparing to enter the STEM workforce, are learning how to do what they do on the basis of social messages and social cues that come to them from their advisors, from other faculty with whom they interact. And so with a consistent faculty culture of teaching is a waste of time, teaching is a detraction, a distraction, and we really don't want to see you doing it, programs like Preparing Future Faculty have the potential to really provide a very different kind of environment, and it's sort of a sea change in terms of what was valued. Unfortunately, what we see is that there continue to be a number of, at best, mixed messages about the value of teaching and working with students in relation to the rewards that are built in for conducting research. Now, in the current environment of the last couple of years, there are some major economic realities that are changing the shape of how the university works. The mission of universities, especially public universities, does entail instruction. And when times are not so tight, when people have, relatively speaking, a lot of money to spend, what happens is that we offload teaching responsibilities to adjunct faculty, clinical faculty, so that the tenure line faculty can really put most of their effort into their research, which is really sort of ultimately what they were trained for, optimally trained for. But as the budget gets tight and people need to make cuts, they look around and they say, hey, we have these tenure faculty and they're not going anywhere. But we don't need to pay extra adjuncts, part-time instructors, clinicals, and so on. And so there's an increasing economic pressure for faculty to take a larger teaching role rather than a reduced teaching role, which is sort of what the culture encourages and rewards. Adding to that, there have been changes in the funding guidelines from organizations like National Science Foundation, where they're capping the amount of faculty compensation that can come through either a single grant or all grants received collectively from that agency. So, for instance, in the science directorates, there is a hard cap of 2 months compensation on senior faculty on NSF grants, which means that you can either pay for your summer or you can buy out of a course, but we're not going to give, even no matter how many grants you have, we're not going to give you more than 2 months worth of salary line support. So you no longer have a model where people can get 12 months salary and teach one class every 2 years or whatever it is based on the number of grant dollars that they're bringing in. So again, graduate students. So with faculty, the increased pressure on faculty to teach, but also still being able to buy out, with full-time instructors being cut back due to budgetary constraints. One of the obvious sources of cheap labor in the grand university model, one of the obvious sources of cheap labor is students. And so there's increased pressure for graduate students in particular to take on teaching roles in relation to undergraduate education. And if these are folks who aren't getting very much training in instruction, who aren't getting very much support for their instruction, again, we see a further erosion of the mechanisms that are supposed to support this pipeline, where people whose job it becomes to teach get very little support, very little training, and very little encouragement, and as a result don't have the tools necessary to, or the time or the value necessary to invest in teaching to ensure that, that students are getting the highest quality education. Again, the consistent message being, spend as much time as you can on your research and your scholarship and as little time as you can on your teaching. But given these economic realities, we often assume, right, that there's this zero-sum game, that to spend more time on teaching or to spend any time teaching is inherently to detract from or undermine your scholarly or research pursuits. But there's really very little empirical evidence that speaks to this. So the overall purpose of this study was to look at the impacts of inquiry-based science teaching experiences on the development of STEM graduate students as researchers. And I'll take a minute to define what we mean by inquiry-based teaching, because not all teaching is created equal. Right? I can give somebody a teaching assistantship and say, go teach this class or this section, and one person may very actively engage it, another person may literally read out of a textbook at the podium for 3 hours and send students on their way. Right? So we didn't want to say, in terms of defining the parameters for the study, what we did not want to do was just say, if you're doing any kind of teaching, if you have any kind of teaching assistantship support, then you count as teaching. What we actually needed to do was to look for quality teaching, look for teaching in particular that supported student inquiry. And that's something that sometimes shows up in a lab course, but not always. So a traditional lab model, the goal of the lab, sometimes people call it a cookbook lab, where the goal of the lab is the undergraduates walk in, they're handed a protocol, and their job is to implement the protocol and make sure that their data matches the expected data, right? And so the problem is that while they learn how to use lab equipment and they learn sort of this lockstep, okay, when I write it up, I have an introduction and I have some methods and results and some conclusions. They learn some sort of formulaic things. What they don't necessarily learn is really how to think about scientific inquiry, because they're not finding anything new. They're not thinking how to frame a problem. They're thinking about how to follow somebody else's directions. Well, there's been a shift away from that, and a number of lab-based courses now really try to foster student inquiry, where students are the ones who, if they're not having the opportunity to frame the research questions themselves, at least they're getting an opportunity to think about how data might be collected, how data might be analyzed, and make some more choices for themselves, so they get some practice in doing this kind of thing. So what we were looking for were people who were doing teaching in environments where students were getting the opportunity to do this kind of inquiry. And the rationale for this is pretty simple. It's a practice effect. If someone is a graduate research assistant and they're going into a lab and working for a researcher full-time, chances are they're not getting much of an opportunity to suggest research questions, to try to formulate testable hypotheses, to think about the best ways to gather data. Chances are that most of the time, the director of the lab or the postdocs who are running a particular project are going to say, okay, go do this, this, and this, and come back and tell me what you find. Right? But folks who are teaching in an inquiry-oriented lab space or an inquiry-oriented classroom are getting an opportunity to help students think about how to do some of these more abstract, scholarly types of things. And so when a student comes and says, how do I create a testable hypothesis, and the graduate student who's teaching actually has to stop and try to explain, well, is this a testable hypothesis? How can we know? How can we make it better? That's actual practice in terms of thinking about how to frame an experiment, which they wouldn't necessarily have gotten if they were working in a research lab and just following somebody else's directions who had already made these decisions. So we're looking for the impact of specifically inquiry-based teaching, because we think that there are actually practice opportunities for important scholarly and research skills that are embedded in teaching opportunities if they're done in an inquiry-oriented way. And so we were hoping to find effects there. So a little bit of information on the background research. So there have been a few large meta-analyses that have been done of studies exploring connections between faculty members' research and teaching. And without exception, what they find is that research and teaching are pretty much orthogonal. They're unrelated, because the metrics that they use in trying to assess the data on this question, people are running correlations between scholarly productivity, so number of articles published, and course evaluations. How good a teacher did the students think you were? The problem is that these metrics aren't particularly appropriate for really addressing this question of, is there value in teaching? Is there skill enhancement in teaching? The first problem is that for most faculty, particularly as they're established, their research productivity on an annual basis is probably fairly stable, and their teaching ratings we see from the literature, actually very stable. They tend not to change their teaching a whole lot, again, because the reward structure isn't really focused on improving the quality of teaching. Well, when you don't have variance in both variables and you do a correlation, you don't get a correlation because one's constant. So it's completely unsurprising that these meta-analyses, looking at across a number of studies, wouldn't find a correlation between research productivity and quality of teaching as measured by student ratings. The second reason that these these findings aren't necessarily helpful is that from experimental research in psychology and education, we've seen beneficial effects of something called the self-explanation effect. Which is basically when you have people who are trying to learn something, if you ask them to explain step by step what they're doing, and pause and reflect and talk their way through the problem-solving process, it turns out that they acquire skills much more quickly and at a much higher level of performance. Again, because they're investing more mental effort in acquiring that skill. So we would think that to whatever extent teaching might involve self-explanation, that we'd see some reinforcement there. And then the third set of evidence that we've been considering is that there are a number of qualitative reports of people's teaching experiences benefiting their research. And one of these, the Becker and Kennedy study that's cited, was actually done in economics. They tracked down 50 people with Nobel Prizes or Fields medals, and basically pestered them until they answered the questions that they had via email correspondence. And they found that a majority of those individuals actually reported that experiences they had while teaching benefited their research and actually sometimes led them in new directions that were very productive. The other study that's cited here is, of course, Dr. Jed Lyons' study looking at the GK-12 fellows, which are an NSF program that supports STEM graduate students who are spending part of their time working in middle schools with teachers and with students. So, in order to look at teaching, turns out that measuring quality of teaching is really challenging, and so we picked two instruments that are done that have some track record in the literature. One's called RTOP, and basically what we did is we went and videotaped all of our participants while they were teaching once a semester and rated that videotape according to a rubric that values inquiry-oriented instruction and high levels of active cognitive student engagement. The other that we used, the LEI Learning Environments Inventory, is a survey-based measure that both the instructor and the students fill out, and they address questions. This is all 1 to 5 Likert kind of stuff, where they're addressing not only what actually happens in the class, but what they'd like to see happen in the class. And so it can be particularly informative to look at how people's perspectives on teaching change as a relationship between what actually happens and what they think should happen. So those were the measures of teaching that we had. We also interviewed students and their graduate advisors to get assessments of their teaching skill development, their research skill development, general socialization, and a number of other things. And the advisors provided us with evaluations of their performance as well. In measuring the research side of things, the scientific side of things, we used two standard tests of scientific reasoning. One is called Lawson's, which is a short multiple choice test, and the other is the ACT test of science reasoning. They are formatted somewhat differently and emphasize different aspects of scientific reasoning, but they're basically the only two standard tests that are used in the literature. And then the last thing we did, and we considered this to be our most authentic form of assessment, was our participants wrote research proposals at the beginning of their year of participation in the study, so in the early fall. And most of our participants were in their first year or two of their graduate programs. And then we asked them in the spring, in late spring, to come back and edit them and resubmit. So they got to revise and resubmit from us for their proposals, and then the pair of submitted proposals were rated as a set to assess their scientific merits along a number of items on the rubric. Excuse me. So so very quickly, here's a breakdown of the first 2 years of the study. Again, we're in the middle of our third year of 3 for data collection now. And currently we have 70 people in our data set. Unfortunately, the trouble with grad students is that they are busy, and so we do have some level of missing data, which cramps our statistical style a little bit. But we have 10 folks who are teaching only. They're doing no research and are just engaged in teaching. We have 29 who are doing research only, so these are full-time supported doctoral students who are being supported in labs. And we have 30 who are doing some combination of teaching and research, be that a combined RA, TA kind of support, or participation in the GK-12 or similar programs. The master's doctoral breakdown, you can see we have about 30 master's students and about 40 doctoral students, but because they're in their first year or two of graduate school, we don't really see many differences between them. They're just starting out. Gender breakdown's about equal. We do have a fairly large, proportionately large representation of English as a second language participants, but that is actually reflective of the graduate student population. So we're happy with it, but the language issues, as we'll talk about in a little bit, become salient. Before I go any further, does anybody have any questions? This is sort of the long range of what we're thinking about and what we're trying to do, but if anybody has questions to this point, I'd be very happy to clarify or. Okay. So one of the things we found is people came in to the study is that there were a surprisingly wide, there's surprisingly large variance in terms of the number of semesters of prior research experience that people had. A lot of at a first glance we'd say, oh, they're in their first year of graduate study and that puts them on par. But when we went and interviewed these folks, some people have been doing supervised research since their freshman year of undergraduate. Some of them have never done it before. And so what we in terms of number of semesters of prior research experience, you can see that we only had 7 with no research experience at all, and we had 4 that came in with 2 full academic years worth of research experience before they started their graduate program. Right, so there's a huge range of differences in terms of people coming in, and that turns out to be very important when we look at the data later on. This graphic, oh good, it does show up pretty well. This graphic represents how the group has performed in relation to the rubric that evaluates the research proposals. And so you can see here we have the introduction, the context that's set for the research, whether or not the hypothesis is testable, or the research, those studies that don't have hypotheses, if the research question was framed so that it could be addressed effectively. Looked at validity and reliability, quality of experimental design, when they were experiments, otherwise studied, non-experimental study design. The data that they selected to use to answer the question, whether or not that was appropriate. The presentation of the data, how effectively they were able to show that data in a way that facilitated interpretation. The data analysis, the conclusions that they drew, and to what extent they were supported by the data. The broader impacts. This is a new element to the rubric that we added that plays off of the National Science Foundation evaluative criterion, and they have 2. One is intellectual merit, and the other is broader impacts, which is how important do we think the research is going to be. The limitations and significance, the primary, their use of primary literature, their use of original source material, and writing quality in general. And so, as you can see, the median for the previous slide, the median was about 1 year or 2 semesters of prior research experience. And so we just used a median split to assess the effects of prior experience on the quality of these research proposals. And the black bars represent people with at least 2 semesters of research experience, and the white bars the gray bars people with less. You can see that there's a lot of variance among individuals, but systematically, what we do see is that even just a year of experience makes a big difference in terms of the quality of proposals that people are able to submit. Some surprising findings, and this is sort of bad news. It turns out that that about half of the research proposals we got had no more than one original publication, no more than one piece of primary literature cited in it. So connection to effective use, scholarly use of literature was really problematic. And 43%, we actually detected plagiarism. We ran all the proposals through what's the name of the system? Through safe assignment, and 43% had some kind of plagiarism in the pre and in the post. When it was detected in the original submission, we would contact the participant and say, hey, we noticed that a lot of this work isn't yours, and it needs to be addressed. And then even in the post, we still saw continuing plagiarism. But what was interesting was that it was not it wasn't out and out plagiarism. It wasn't the most evil kind of plagiarism, which is instead of doing my own work, I'm going to use somebody else's work. What we really found is that it reflected much more a lack of understanding about what the social and academic norms were, and about appropriate citation mechanism, more than just wanting to be lazy or wanting to speed up production. So we saw a failure to cite, insufficient paraphrasing, and so that's an area that we're sort of digging into a little bit further. What does this have to do with the connection between teaching and research? On its own merits, not a whole lot, except that perhaps we need to really focus some graduate instruction on these plagiarism issues, which a lot of times we tend to assume by the time someone's a doctoral student, they know how to cite a paper and what the appropriate guidelines are. Turns out that's not a good assumption, but it was very important for consideration of our data because if we're evaluating these research reports as evidence of people's skill, need to factor in. Okay. Is this visible, reasonably visible? Okay. Absolutely. So the data that I'm going to show you currently is the result of a general linear model where we factored in several things beyond just whether people were doing research only or whether they were doing teaching and research together. These graphs indicate also the level of the prior level of research experience that they had coming in. So and it also controls for the quality of teaching, because remember our hypothesis was that that inquiry-oriented teaching, inquiry-based teaching, was going to be helpful, but a standard delivered lecture wasn't really necessarily going to do much to foster. So the way that the data that we culled the data that I'm going to show you now was that we took an aggregate, we took an average of all of the teaching measures that we had, and found the mean. And we're only looking at people in the top half of the distribution. So this is anybody at or above the mean in terms of the extent of their inquiry-based teaching. And you can see up here, when we say relative experience is 0, means that they had less than 2 semesters of research experience coming in. When it's a 1, that's 2 or greater. And what you can see is that the interaction effects differ radically. Right. These graphs look at the quality of the hypothesis that was put into the research proposal. Okay. So this is how and the x-axis, the 1 at the bottom is the pre-test. The 2 at the bottom is the post-test. So we're looking over the course of a year how the scores changed for people who were doing a good job of inquiry teaching. Right. So for folks who came in with very little experience, the teaching seems to really have, the green line are folks who are teaching and research. The blue line is people who are research only. You can see that the folks who were doing both teaching and research had a much steeper gain on the quality of their hypotheses, how testable they were from pre to post. Right. The research only folks had some gain as well, but not nearly the same magnitude. When we look, and that trend actually stayed. Was reflected to a lesser extent with the folks who came in with more experience. So here we saw an instance where our expectations were met, and because if we're helping students to think about testable hypotheses, it should be that that helping people to do that is equivalent to some kind of practice, and so expect to see some improvement, which we did. Not everything looks like this, though. In a number of cases, what we saw was that the benefits depended on the amount of research experience. So for folks who had very little research experience coming in, this is evaluating the quality of experimental design. Folks with no research experience, first of all, did poorly, but second of all, didn't improve. Folks who were doing research only, their experimental design did improve. This is for people with little experience. Right? Now we get to people who come in with some experience, and the trend switches. So it turns out that if you have a certain amount of experience coming in, that the teaching seems to differentially benefit your skill development in that area. Again, we think a practice effect, a self-explanation effect. But you need to know enough of what you're talking about to get the benefit of that practice. So if you're really new to research, you don't have an adequate level of understanding of the research, it's not going to help you. And really being in a highly structured traditional research environment, it seems, does pay off differentially. But if you have some, we'll call it a threshold level of skill or knowledge in the area, then the teaching seems to help you practice that skill more effectively. Here we're looking at data analysis, and I'm picking and choosing, and I'll explain why in just a minute. So for the quality of the data analysis, you can see here that the teaching and research folks stayed again relatively flat with no experience. The folks who were in research only had much more dramatic growth. People with experience, you actually didn't see really much difference at all in terms of the trajectory of their skill development. And so, so again, we see that there may be some kind of threshold here where once there's sort of a minimal level of knowledge, you stay there for a little while, and then there may be a dramatic increase up. And there are obviously we generate a very large number of graphs because for each element of the rubric and for each level of experience we had a different slide. I'll tell you that that most of the elements of the rubric look like this. It turns out that in only a couple of cases did we see a negative trend. So for instance this kind of scenario where where research only did significantly better, we did have some of those kinds of findings. Typically, it only happened with lower levels of experience or higher levels of experience. It wasn't both. We didn't find any instances where it was all the time, no matter what, best to be in a research lab for the elements we had. So typically, we saw that there was an interaction for one of the subpopulations, and then we had these roughly parallel lines for the others. Let's see. Here's use of primary literature. And you can see that this is an area in which, if you have no experience, being in the research lab helps you to use primary literature better. Could just be you're spending a lot more time dealing with the primary literature. You're in the lab, people are talking about findings that are being published and so on. When you have more experience, it turns out that it seems that there's a little bit of an advantage on the teaching and research, but again, with these graphs, one of the reasons there aren't p-values attached to these is that we're underpowered right now. We need our last year of data in order to get enough power, because by the time you finish controlling for the prior experience and the condition with the repeated measures, it starts to eat away at your degrees of freedom. So these are some preliminary trends. This is one more. Oh, yeah, I forgot about the red. Folks viewing at home, this may not be very pretty. What you're looking at here is a correlation matrix where we have gain scores in the elements of the rubric across the top, and gain scores in the quality of teaching from fall to spring as the y-axis. The cells that are highlighted in yellow, the cells that are highlighted are significant correlations. The ones that are highlighted in yellow are positive correlations. The ones highlighted in red are negative. Okay, and so the number and location of these yellow cells is something that we're very excited about, because, and again, these numbers may be a little small. The correlation coefficients between the gains in teaching and the gains in research are incredibly high. Particularly for social sciences. This is an R of 0.87, 0.715, 763, 728. Right, so correlation coefficients in the 0.7, 0.8 range for folks who are doing both teaching and research show that their gains are highly correlated for the things that we'd expect to see if you are getting a practice effect through teaching. Right, contextualizing research correlated with gains in the extent to which students are getting to do investigations. So as you're working with students, helping them to make sense of their findings, letting them do their own investigations, the context of the study, the rationale for the study becomes more important, because students are needing to find their own way rather than you're doing the study I'm telling you because I'm telling you to do it. They need to understand why they'd be asking the question they're asking. The one up at the top in the second column, that's the quality of the hypothesis, correlated with personal relevance. Don't have a ready explanation for that one, but we're working on it. The interview data may prove to be helpful in that regard. Correlation of gain here between the quality of validity and reliability controlled in the study, and the teacher's gain in terms of their understanding of the nature of science, which includes the logic of logic of data analysis, logic of scientific method. And then this last one over here, this is the quality of the results section. So this is data selection, data presentation, data analysis. Overall, highly correlated with student negotiation, which is giving students the opportunity to reason through data and to argue through data. So teachers helping students to do this is correlated with increases in their own level of skill as well. The negatives We have a negative correlation with the quality of the discussion, the discussion section in the proposal. Negatively correlated with students' nature of science gain. Don't know why. Still looking into that. The nice thing about a mixed method study is there are lots of data sources. The bad thing about a mixed method study is there's a whole lot of data sources, and so we're still digging through and trying to triangulate against our various pieces. This correlation, the discussion of limitations, the gain in that area was negatively correlated with students' nature of science gains as well. So what we have is an incomplete but emerging picture of that's promising but not yet conclusive that there are benefits to teaching if you are trying to build research skill. And so the good news is that if these trends continue and we get sufficient power to make these claims in a broader way, the good news is that as resources continue to be drawn away from universities towards other goals, and we start needing to rely on graduate students to teach more, it's not the zero-sum game detrimental model that's currently conceptualized in many research-focused cultures that and in fact can serve as a benefit to graduate students coming in. Now, the fact that you don't have systematic benefits across the board indicates that we need to think carefully about what would be the biggest payoff and the biggest limitations to having graduate students assume a greater teaching role, right? And so we found a differential effect based on the level of research. It may be that to get the optimal effect of teaching as a benefit for the development of research skills, not only do we need to pay attention to what kind of teaching is going on, but we also need to think about how much experience students have coming in and whether or not it would in fact be in their best interest in relation to the skills they need to develop earlier. Just quick acknowledgement: the grant was supported, as I mentioned, by the National Science Foundation. It was awarded to myself, to Briana, also to Steve Thompson from the School of Education, Michelle Maher from the School of Education, and Dr. Jed Lyons from the Center for Teaching Excellence. If anybody has any questions about what we found so far, where we're going, or any concerns or objections, we'd like to encourage you to ask.
Well, I guess I had one question, and that has to do with your definition of inquiry-based teaching or inquiry-based learning. That it seems to me that within that tent there are lots of flavors,
yes.
And you could have some axes like situations where teachers might set students a specific problem to deal with, and then they have to develop some kind of inquiry approach to that problem. Another end of that spectrum might be where the students are really encouraged to come up with their own problems and then to problematize them. So, I mean, there's just
right.
Lots of different ways. And I'm just wondering if you have anything. I know you've got a small number here, but you do have a lot of qualitative data, and I'm wondering if you see any differences with kind of different frameworks for inquiry, or different, like maybe things that are more lab-based, or things that are more based in the literature, or that kind of thing.
I can tell you that at a project level, nothing has shown up yet, but I'm not the one who deals most directly with this data, and so fortunately we have a few folks with us who might be able to speak to it. Briana, because you're up here, you may have some feeling for this, but we also have some of the students who are working on the project who code all of that qualitative data, which and so actually getting your hands on text can be handy for this.
To address your question, Bob, we have very similar suspicions that the quality of the teaching experience has a strong effect on how much interaction it has with the students' development of research skills. it's an issue of sample size at the moment. So there was far greater variation in the teaching experiences that the students were having than we had originally conceptualized. So the GK-12 students were going out to the middle schools, one that's a very different venue, and then the perspectives that the mentor teachers, the middle school teachers had towards teaching very strongly influenced what and how much the graduate students got to do in that classroom, and there was a really large spectrum of the kinds of teaching that they were allowed to engage in there. Then back here in the university, teaching in lab courses, in biology, chemistry. I don't think we had anybody in engineering who was TAing. Exercise science. Those were less variable in the kinds of things that they did, but there was still a spectrum there. So that's why we were going to the RTOP and the LEI scores as a means of trying to get a handle on it. One of the interesting things that came out of this is we've actually learned STEM tends to lump science, technology, math, and engineering, but that those things are not as similar, at least as I had personally thought. Math turns out to be really different in how they do research. Good inquiry-based teaching looks really different in math, and the RTOP was not particularly designed for that, so we had to make a number of modifications there. RTOP is Reformed Teaching Observation Protocol. It's out of Arizona.
Developed in the physics education literature.
So there's a lot more disciplinary kind of interaction than you would have thought at the beginning.
Yeah, that was an unexpected source of variation, and then, as I said, the extent of the spectrum of actual teaching experiences was larger than we'd hoped for initially. So our sample size gets bigger every year. So.
Yeah, but part of it is that there's no way that certainly in the scope of this study, anything short of a national study probably isn't going to get sufficient power to be able to tease out disciplinary interactions with these things as well. But I can say that where we've had multiple participants from the same discipline, that we've seen as much variation within the participants as across the disciplines. Now, again, underpowered to say the very least. Sometimes it's, well, we got one that did this and one that did this, and they weren't the same. So it's limited, but at least there's some indication that the discipline isn't a huge influence, at least in the first year with the measures that we're using.
Frankly, that's part of the reason why we're heartened to see effects at all.
Right.
With this degree of variation, the fact that something's coming through means that there must be something going on.
Yeah. Our program manager at NSF told me that we were the high-risk, high-reward project for the funding cycle. And I think we've certainly proven the first. We're hopefully we get to the second as well.
Please, questions. We're really hoping to open this up to discussion in the second half.
The charts that you showed were for participants that were above the median in which
Teaching,
category?
in the quality of teaching. This is everybody who's at or above mean in, basically I created a really rough index of teaching that was an aggregate of all of our teaching measures. So this was RTOP and LEI lumped together, everything averaged in, just to get some kind of rough cut of what teaching quality might be.
Have we looked at the other half?
No, haven't looked at the other half. Well, yes, looked briefly at the other half. At the other half, what we saw, and it's going to be hard to tease out, was overall everything was lower, and so we need to take a look and see how much things like ability and it might have played a role where you sort of get a rising tide floats all boats kind of effect. But looking at again, we would hypothesize that we wouldn't see a lot. We hypothesized we wouldn't see a lot there, and there wasn't a lot there. The hypothesis was that we would see a good amount at the upper end, and that's what we were seeing. But again, the data analysis is becoming increasingly complex rather than increasingly simple as we dig further into it. So,
what if we looked at the median of their research ability and separated them by high research ability and low research ability, and then have you done that kind of thing? And then looked at how the teaching, the poor teaching and good teaching experiences affect?
The only thing that I've used to do that was the Lawson Test, which is, according to some, a much more of a general reasoning ability test than an actual science reasoning test per se. And what we found there was that there is an overall effect. If you factor out Lawson's score, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The folks who have a lower score on Lawson's really fall through the floor when you factor that out, and the folks who have a higher Lawson's still continue to do fairly well. So again, it's trying to figure out what our measures actually mean turns out to be an ugly post hoc problem, because in the literature, in terms of defining what scientific reasoning is, people can talk about it and wave their hands, but in terms of getting, it's right in terms of actually having a rigorous operational definition in a nomological network, it's just not there. So I suppose the very short answer is no. We don't have a definite read on that. We've dug into it and played with it, and what we're finding is difficult to interpret at this point until we've better utilized our qualitative data to fill in gaps.
When you were discussing past work, you mentioned that there was a study where they tracked down all these famous professors and asked them about their teaching research productivity, and you said they found that there was a correlation. Was that? Did I recall that information right?
Yes, yes. The Kennedy and Becker study. This was done in economics, and they tracked down 50. Kennedy and Becker are two very high-profile economists, and they're editors. I think they either are or were at the time of the study editors of one of the major journals. So they were able to, and they said literally in the article, they said we were able to badger our colleagues until they responded. So they talked to 50 very, very high-profile economists and asked them what kinds of experiences, to what extent they had interactions between their teaching and research experiences, and left it very open. And what they said, and I have the PDF on the laptop. I could probably hunt it down, but a majority of the respondents reported that they had at least one experience where something that happened in the teaching context helped them in terms of their research. So got them thinking in new directions, or somebody asked a question that framed something just right to help them sort of take a new step forward, that kind of thing.
The reason I asked that question is because I'm asking the context of the NSF career proposal. How do you tie teaching and research? I wanted to know what that study found. Was there something they did in teaching that helped them with their research?
You can the citation afterwards.
Yeah, no, I can give you the citation. We can talk about it. We've actually given a few conference talks about this. So there's more than just that. Is the good news. There are a few, but as far as the details, there's no magic bullet. But I'm happy to talk more with you about it after we're off the camera.
One of the motivations for our study, though, is when you look in the literature, most of the past work has been on perceptions. So people's perceptions of how teaching affects their research, and that was the case with that study. And there's been very little actual fine-grained performance data. So in the bean counting kind of a way, where if you count up the number of publications that someone has and you add up their course evaluations, but then that's students' perceptions of their teaching ability, that doesn't actually tell you very much about what they do in the classroom. It just tells you that students like them.
Or didn't like them.
Or didn't like them. Whereas having actual performance data on teaching and performance data on research, and nothing on graduate students, they
right.
been found. Right?
That's right. Prior to our project, certainly at the publication level, there's been nothing that's performance based. There's been survey based stuff, and there's been secondary document based stuff, but nobody's actually gone out and gotten performance data from graduate students because they're busy and hard to track down.
You're saying that this sort of project has been done on literature as well?
I don't know. Not that we've run across, but we haven't looked extensively in those disciplines. And we're thinking very much in STEM disciplines.
Yeah,
I've seen a few things in business, and you have that economics paper, but I don't recall anything in the humanities.
yeah. But the nature of scholarship is also fundamentally different in the humanities than it is in more empirically driven sciences. So I would expect the way that these things play out to be very, very different. It could be that there's even more of a benefit in humanities than there is otherwise, because ultimately it's a lot of discursive argument rather than some of the ways that we parse information and analyze it in the natural and behavioral sciences.
Surprisingly, it's the same language, though. I mean, we would still use inquiry. I mean, even scientific methods, like you have an inquiry, you frame questions, and then you look into the text, and then you come up with conclusions. But the reason why I asked that question was I have noticed that there are places, let's say, advertising for postdoctoral positions. They do ask a statement on how your teaching is, or how is your research related to your teaching. Now, these are things that probably we don't learn in graduate classrooms. So I often wonder how would one even write that? I mean, it's certainly very personal and very reflective, but at the same time, that's the reason why I thought about it.
Well, I would make one definite guess about things. One of the things that's come out of this that's been really exciting for me has been realizing how much of the enculturation is implicit. Graduate students show up and faculty sort of greet them, but it seems like 90% of what the graduate students are learning is not from things that faculty instruct them on directly, but from watching from the atmosphere of the scholarly environment. And I think there's a real opportunity, and I'm guessing this is an opportunity also in the humanities and not just in STEM, but for advisors to accelerate their graduate students' development, particularly in the beginning, if you sit down and explicitly address a number of these basic enculturation things. I mean, it was just frankly shocking when the research proposals started coming in that there was, a quarter to a third of them that just had websites, like not even a secondary reference to be found within 100 miles. I mean, and it really, in talking back and forth with the students about the plagiarism issues, it really became clear that they just didn't know, that no one had ever had a discussion with them, that primary literature existed, much less what you do with it and how it should fit in. And so there seems to be a real opportunity there for faculty to introduce graduate students intentionally to the primary literature and how you use it. And that seems to happen. It just seems to happen in a much more sort of haphazard, at some point somebody mentions something to you about it, or your faculty member hands you a paper but doesn't teach you how to deal with it or talk about it in real intentional ways.
Yeah, and to pick up on, so you had said where would a graduate student go? I saw head movement, so I'm guessing that CTE may have something, either a program directly or an idea of resources on campus.
You came to Ivy's workshop on teaching philosophy statements?
Yeah.
We'd be happy to follow up with you on that some more.
Actually, one other thing that we found in the course of all of this, beyond the fact that students have these plagiarism problems that are sort of undiagnosed, it turns out that there are also faculty accuracy problems. In the interviews, we asked faculty members to talk about their advisees' strengths and weaknesses as researchers, and we then took those assessments and compared them against the scores on the rubrics that are independently blindly rated, and in roughly two-thirds of the cases, the faculty member's assessment was no better than chance at aligning with the quantitative estimate of quality, and in an additional, I don't recall the percentage offhand, probably an additional sixth of the total sample, when they were significantly different than chance, they were significantly worse than chance in accurately assessing against an independently evaluated performance criterion what their students' strengths and weaknesses were. So we're popping the hood on graduate education, and it turns out that there are a number of mechanisms that
So that could either be the measure is bad, or that the
faculty members are off. The good news is that the rubric is the most thoroughly vetted instrument we have. I believe Briana's been working with this in various forms for a number of years, so you may want to speak to that.
My read on that would be the conclusion is not that faculty don't know what they're talking about. It's not that faculty can't assess the performance of their graduate students, so much as I think it's that faculty aren't interacting with their students enough to have, like they don't know them well enough to accurately assess them. So, yeah, I don't want faculty to think that we're saying that they're not capable.
Right, because our participants are in their first or second year, so they haven't been working together all that long. Though it turned out that, so we had the pre-measure and the post-measure, and it actually turned out that the student accuracy on self-assessment went up from fall to spring, and the faculty accuracy went down from fall to spring. So part of it is they don't know them and don't necessarily know them well enough. But the other piece of it is there was what consistently showed up as being accurate was when faculty said that students either understood the bigger picture surrounding the research or didn't. That was almost 100% of the time right on. It was in some of the more technical skills where they wouldn't, you don't, when in the course of a conversation with an advisee, you don't necessarily talk through the statistical analyses of a project very often, but you will talk about more big picture things. And so probably the areas in which students tend to get the most mentorship are the areas in which the mentors tend to be would likely be the most accurate in their assessment. And so you get it's this sort of tricky interaction where the same interaction that would inform an assessment is also the same interaction that changes the knowledge state of the student.
And there are sort of two take-home institutional messages from this. One is that I think one is that graduate students are getting a lot of mentorship and a lot of instruction from non-faculty advisors, that there's likely a large peer community that's going on. And I don't think we've paid enough attention to that in the past to sort of recognize that if there's teaching and instruction and graduate student development going on in this venue, we need to sort of recognize that, if for no other reason, so that we can use it in a positive way. And the other is that I don't know whether it's possible at an institution level or at a CTE kind of level to have workshops on, primary literature and why you should be happy about it, or those kinds of things. But I think graduate students could be getting a lot farther in the first 2 years than they seem to be due to lack of faculty time, if nothing else.
Yeah, and the university is a cultural institution. Right? Most of the scholarship on graduate education talks about the socialization of graduate students into the discipline and into academia. It does not talk about an instructional design process where we do a needs assessment and build in explicitly targeted interventions to develop certain skill sets. And so the problem is that, first of all, there's a whole lot that we don't know because we're not collecting that kind of data, right? But the second thing is that a lot of what we see in terms of, we have major attrition in graduate programs. A lot of it, probably most of the people who drop out, it's not capable of doing the work. It's that they actually just need somebody to show them how. And that's not what universities do, certainly at the graduate level and arguably even at the undergraduate level in certain areas. So it's something to consider if we can control the graduate attrition problem, if we wanted to, right? And there's some question about what would we do with double the number of PhDs, given that there are already lots of PhDs who don't necessarily have a doctoral level landing spot, professionally speaking. But it would fundamentally involve a move away from education and towards training, the way those terms are conventionally used. So there are deeper issues there that
It's actually been interesting. I'm sorry that Michelle had to go, but the American model that we have, where you get a PhD and you are therefore now capable of training other people, in K-12, we never let people into the classroom without some kind of pedagogical background.
Right. You have your high school diploma, now you can go teach. This is.
You know, I just returned from the UK where new faculty are now being required to take a course, a series of courses in teaching, and usually within the first 2 years they need to earn a master's degree in teaching in their discipline as sort of part of their early career expectations.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I don't have anything quantified, but there's a listserv that I've been on that's been talking about over the last couple of months that in many other countries you're not allowed to mentor graduate students until you pass through some kind of training or some kind of apprenticeship yourself on how to mentor. And that was just such a new concept.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. But I'd like to say that, it sounds like got some interesting results, but I think one of the best things is the project seems to have created more researchable questions.
Yes.
So that's the best type of research that leads to additional avenues to pursue. So if y'all would join me in thanking our speakers today.